Meghan O'Rourke is a writer, poet, and editor. She's the author of The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, that just came out in 2022, the best-selling memoir, The Long Goodbye, and the poetry collections Sun in Days, which was named a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year, Once, and Half-Life, which was a finalist for the Patterson Poetry Prize and Britain's Forward First Book Prize. O'Rourke is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Writing Nonfiction Award, the May Sarton Poetry Prize, the Union League Prize for Poetry from the Poetry Foundation, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. Her essays, criticism, and poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Slate, Poetry, Kenyon Review, and Best American Poetry, among others. O'Rourke is the editor of the Yale Review. From the Star Review in Publishers Weekly, they write, with a poet's sensibility, a journalist's rigor, and patient's personal investment, O'Rourke sheds light on the physical and mental toll of having a mysterious chronic illness. Quote, I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. She writes before delving into the decades-long game of cat and mouse. She played with symptoms ranging from rashes to exhaustion, starting in the late 1990s. Please help me welcome Meghan O'Rourke.
Hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yes. Jennifer, thank you so much for that thoughtful and beautiful introduction and for having me here today. As you may soon be able to hear, I have a little cold, or I'm sick, but not sick in the way this book describes. So excuse me if I have to stop and sniffle for a second, but I'm so pleased to be here tonight. I'm just utterly thrilled to read with my dear friend, Cathy Park Hong, and talk with you. I'm hearing you guys can't hear very well. Is the volume okay? No? Yes? Is that better? Better. Yeah. I'm just so excited to be here with my dear friend Cathy Park Hong, who, in addition to being a really close friend of mine, was somebody whom I shared early drafts of this book with. So tonight I am going to read for about 10 minutes, and then Cathy's going to read, and then we're going to talk, I think. We wanted to leave a lot of time for conversation about our writing process, and also time for questions from all of you. I'm hoping that now the volume is a little better. Yeah? Doing okay. Cool. Okay. So this book, one of the challenges of writing this book was that I knew it was going to be partly memoir and partly quite a lot of research about our current healthcare system and some concepts from science and the history of science, concepts about how we think about disease and the history that's led to the ways we think about disease, that I really wanted to weave into this book because they spoke to the problem I found myself in as a patient and as a person, which was that I was living with a mysterious chronic illness that no one could identify, including really myself. At first, I wasn't even sure I was sick. And so to answer the question of why was that and why did it take so long to get that diagnosis, I had to do a lot of research, right? As a person and then also as a writer, because the autobiographical problem I had became a really interesting writerly problem, right? Which is what accounts for spots of cultural blindness of places we can't see? What accounts for the ways in which we fail to listen to people who are testifying to their own reality? What are the factors that led us to that place? So with no further ado, I am going to just read a little bit here. This is from the introduction. The stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen during a routine exam, the doctor's call. Several people are saying they can't hear very well. Let's see. I mean, is that true for lots of people? My volume is all the way up. Hang on a second. You know what? I'm going to check my mic quickly. Sorry, everyone. It's hard for me to tell if this is a problem everyone is having or just, hang on, let's see if I can set the mic. Is this a little bit better? Hopefully. Yes. Okay. Looks like it reset itself while I was doing a podcast. Okay. All right. We'll start over. Introduction. The stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen during a routine exam, the doctor's call. Not mine. I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. One way to tell my story would be to say that I got ill just after college in the late 1990s, when I began experiencing daily hives, dizziness, chronic pain, and drenching night sweats, long before any doctor believed I was sick. Another way to tell my story would be to say the illness took hold in the days after my mother died on Christmas of 2008. When I caught a virus, a debilitating fatigue overcame me, my lymph nodes ached for months, and I slid into an exhausted fog I attributed to grief. A month later, a doctor found that I had Epstein-Barr virus. Still another way would be to say that my illness became unignorable roughly 3 years after my mother's death, starting in January 2012, on a windy beach by a derelict hotel in Vietnam. Jim, my partner, and I were reading by the water when I noticed a strange rash on my inner arm, 7 or 8 raised red bumps arranged in a circle. It looks like Braille, I thought, but what was it trying to tell me? The beach was a mess that day, scattered with the skeletal alien branches of palm trees. I was in the grips of the discomforting loneliness that can come when wild weather presses around you. Look at this, I said to Jim, who glanced at the angry, inflamed rash and said, that's strange. It was strange, stranger than I imagined at the time. I had no idea then that I was living at the edge of medical knowledge. I had been intermittently unwell since I graduated from college in 1997 and now was getting steadily worse, like a person who can't swim, moving step by step into deep water. But no one knew why. At first, no one even believed I was ill. Not even I did, exactly. Trapped in a body that wasn't working, I embarked on a complicated and obsessive quest for answers. I was met by turns with cutting skepticism, but also authentic concern from clinicians, friends, and colleagues. I eventually received an initial diagnosis of an autoimmune disease, but the diagnosis did not fully explain my symptoms. I tried many therapies and approaches toward healing during my search for understanding and effective treatment. In the meantime, the mysterious chronic illness I lived with got worse, not better, leaving me almost entirely unrecognizable to myself. As a child, I would wake early in the mornings with a sense of life's promise as sun drifted into my bedroom, feeling joy at what lay ahead. After I reached my sickest, I dreaded waking because my symptoms were always worse in the morning and because I knew the day would be full of suffering without explanation. In the grips of a malaise I had no name for, I needed understanding. I turned to literature, science, philosophy, doctors, healers, historians, researchers, and other patients. Along the way, I became interested in the contradictions and complexities of our medical system, in the obstacles faced by patients whose illnesses are poorly understood, and in the question of what might help me live with these illnesses, even if I could not overcome them. While there was no single answer, one thing stood out. Above all, I wanted recognition of the reality of my experience, a sense that others saw it, not least because human ingenuity might then be applied to the disease that had undone me, so that others might in the future suffer less than I did. And there are a lot of people suffering. We are all familiar with the ubiquity of long-term illnesses like heart disease and cancer, which are well defined and viewed as unquestionably real, even if much remains to be learned about them. But what is less well known is that there is also a silent epidemic of chronic illnesses that are often marginalized, contested, or even unrecognized. Illnesses that include autoimmune diseases, myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS is the acronym, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, or chronic Lyme disease, as many patients call it, dysautonomia, mast cell activation syndrome, fibromyalgia, and now on a scale that is only beginning to be recognized, long COVID. If every age has its representative signature disease, I contend that this type of chronic illness is ours. These illnesses are, of course, distinct from one another, but they are often characterized by dysregulation of the immune system and the nervous system, which are powerfully intertwined in our bodies. And some researchers suspect that there may be meaningful overlap in how these illnesses work and in the people who have them. In other words, if you have one of these illnesses, you may be more likely to have others. They are conditions that modern medicine knows surprisingly little about, and that, evidence suggests, can be triggered by multiple causes, including the body's response to infections. The category is also growing in size. To take one example, autoimmune diseases are rising at what scientists call epidemic rates. They now affect from 24 million to 50 million people in the United States. When I got acutely sick in 2012, such illnesses were poorly studied and rarely discussed, and often seen as manifestations of underlying mental illness. Marginalized patients who felt mysteriously unwell had to band together into activist groups to try to legitimize their suffering. A decade later, a year into the coronavirus pandemic, things look a bit different. Autoimmune disease is a mainstream subject. Doctors now tout the importance of the microbiome and gut health, which not long ago seemed like a fringe idea. Most dramatically, the COVID-19 pandemic has given us a keen sense of how variable the human response to infection can be, vividly dramatizing the ways that a virus or bacterium, or multiple viruses and bacteria, can collide with an individual's biology to unleash a host of perplexing after effects in the body, often incited by the individual's immune system. The scope of the problem of COVID-19 long haulers has begun to bring more attention to these chronic syndromes. Even so, many people are still suffering in silence with poorly understood illnesses. As Susan Sontag pointedly observes in Illnesses metaphor, illnesses we don't understand are frequently viewed as manifestations of inner states. The less we understand about a disease, the more we psychologize and often stigmatize it. Doctors once thought of multiple sclerosis as a form of hysteria. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was originally called, was viewed until scientists discovered the bacterium that causes it as a disease that afflicted romantic young souls. For decades, certain forms of cancer were thought to be a consequence of repressed emotions. Today, we like to believe that we are rational about disease and immune to this kind of metaphorical thinking. But research shows that medicine is still riddled with such views, particularly when it comes to hard to identify illnesses, which are often seen as symptoms of some deeper psychological or existential problem. While advances in our understanding of mental illness constitute one of the great successes of 20th century medicine, patients with poorly understood illnesses confront an often reflexive categorization of their physical symptoms as mental ones, which presents a barrier to proper care and research. If medicine can't see or name the problem, it can neither study it nor treat it. This medical uncertainty compounds patients' own uncertainty. Because my unwellness did not take the form of a disease I understood, with a clear-cut list of symptoms and a course of treatment, even I at times interpreted it as a series of signs about my very existence. Initially, the illness seemed to be a condition that signified something deeply wrong with me, illness as a kind of semaphore. Without answers, at my most desperate, I came to feel, in some unarticulated way, that if I could just tell the right story about what was happening, I could make myself better. If only I could figure out what that story was, like the child in a fantasy novel who must discover her secret name, I could become myself again. It took years before I realized that the illness was not just my own. The silence around suffering was our society's pathology. I'll stop there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meghan. That was great. It was so great to hear you read from this. I've been following on Facebook as you've been working and researching this book. So it's so nice to finally have it in the world and see the wonderful reception it's getting. And now we're going to hear from Cathy Parkhong. Her New York Times bestselling book of creative nonfiction, Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, was published in spring 2020 by Random House. Minor Feelings was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography, and earned her recognition on Time's 100 Most Influential People of 2021 list. She is also the author of poetry collections Engine Empire, published in 2012 by Norton, Dance Dance Revolution, chosen by Adrienne Rich for the Barnard Women Poets Prize. She is the recipient of the Wyndham Chapel Prize, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Her prose and poetry have been published in the New York Times, New Republic, The Guardian, Paris Review, Poetry, and elsewhere. She is the poetry editor of the New Republic and is a professor at Rutgers Newark. Claudia Rankin says of her work, Cathy Parkhong's brilliant, penetrating, and unforgettable Minor Feelings is what was missing on our shelf of classics. To read this book is to become more human. Please help me welcome Cathy Parkhong.
Hi. I am super excited to have this conversation with Meghan, who, as she said, we're very close friends. I feel like I've been with her since the beginning of this journey, writing Invisible Kingdom. We used to trade work, trade chapters, poems, and Meghan also read very early embarrassing drafts of Minor Feelings. And I like to say that she helped teach me how to write nonfiction. I don't know if Minor Feelings wouldn't have existed without her guidance. So I'm so grateful and really happy to be here and help her celebrate her book, her very powerful and necessary book. So I thought I would just read a tiny bit of Minor Feelings, which is a collection of 7 essays, interlinked essays on the Asian American condition, sort of my appraisal of it, exploring sort of the interior consciousness of myself as thinking about Asian American as a racialized identity. And I think there are definitely some links, some threads between Meghan's book and my book, because both of her books deal with how the powers that be, whether that is the state or culture or the medical profession, how the powers that be don't recognize the reality or don't receive the reality in which we perceive, and how our sense of self gets lost because of that. So even though she's dealing with chronic illness and I'm dealing with racial identity, I think there's a lot of crossover. So I thought I would read a tiny bit from my Bad English, which is just about being bad at English when I was a kid, and how that both shaped my identity, but also my formation as a poet. And, it's one of my lighter essays, which is why I'm choosing to read it. So yeah, here goes. Bad English. I had a special, almost erotic relationship with my stationery when I was young. I collected stationery items the way other kids collect dolls or action figures. Really, I must buy a pencil, Virginia Woolf said without warning before rushing out the door to begin her peregrination throughout the wintry streets of London. I would have related to her urgency. I too felt passionately for the lead pencil, as long as it was a thin, lavender mechanical pencil with a Hello Kitty bauble clasped to the tip with a delicate silver chain, and erasers too, scented raspberry or vanilla molded into plump pastel wall-eyed Sanrio critters. I adored my erasers so much I had to repress the urge to bite their heads off. I was careful at first, gently brushing the bob feet against my notebook, but once my eraser was spoiled with graphite, I ruthlessly rubbed away my errors until all that remained was a gray, dusty nub of face with one sad punctuation of an eye. For some reason, I was a target in church camp where the Korean girls my age ostracized me out of their room, claiming all the beds, saying they were taken even if they were not. So I was forced to bunk with the younger girls in the next room. One early morning, I was betrayed by my beloved stationery. I opened up my Hello Kitty diary, which I'd left unlocked, and saw that someone had inscribed on the first page in neat cursive that must have been written with a mechanical pencil, "Kitty, go home." The Korean girls I knew were so moody, they made Sylvia Plath seem as dull as C-SPAN. Some were from LA's Koreatown, wore fake juicy couture, applied makeup like cholas, and spoke in the regional Creole accent of fob, gangster, and valley. "Bitch, what are you looking at? Are you lesbo?" asked one girl named Grace when she caught me gawking at her white ghost lips outlined in black lip pencil. Later, I tried to look up lesbo in the dictionary and was relieved that I couldn't find it. Because I grew up around bad English, I was bad at English. I was born in LA, but wasn't fluent until the embarrassingly delayed age of 6, maybe even 7. Matriculating at school was like moving to another country. Up until then, I was surrounded by Korean. The English heard in church among friends and family in K-Town was short, barbed, and broken. Subject and object nouns conjoined in odd marriages, verbs forever disagreeing, definite articles nowhere to be found. Teenagers ventured by interjecting Korean with the ever-present fuck. Fuck him, Oppa's an asshole. The immigrants' first real introduction to surviving in English is profanity. When my cousins came over to the US, I immediately passed on a cache of curse words to them to prepare for school. My uncle said he used to start and end all of his sentences with motherfucker because he learned his English from his Black customers when he was a clothing wholesaler in New York. My uncle, a profane and boisterous man, has since returned to Seoul and keeps up his English with me. So this is a little snippet of a dialogue between this uncle and me. "Uncle, what is the word? The word when you have lice down there." Niece: "Crabs?" Uncle: "Yes, crabs. I have learned a new English word, crabs. It is what I had once." Niece: ... Uncle: "It is not what you are thinking. I did not get it from a whore." Niece: "How'd you get it?" Uncle: "Military service. It was so easy to get the crab. There were no bathrooms, only hole in the ground. We had to shave, so we had no hair down there. A terrible time. Once we tied a man to a tree and left him there." English was always borrowed from hip hop to Spanglish to Simpsons. Early on, my father learned that in America, one must be emotionally demonstrative to succeed. So he has a habit of saying, "I love you" indiscriminately to his daughters, to his employees, to his customers, and to airline personnel. He must have observed a salesman affectionately slap another salesman on the back while saying, "Love you, man, good to see you." But because there is no fraternizing man or slap on the back, his usage has an indelicate intimacy, especially since he quietly unloads endearment as a burning confession. "Thanks for getting those orders in," he'll say before hanging up the phone. "Owen Kirby, I love you." I did not actually use my mechanical pencils so much as line them up to admire them. My mechanical pencils in pistachio plum and cotton candy pink were wands of sublime femininity that had to be saved for later. The longer I saved them, the more unbearable became my need to use them. But still I denied myself because the exquisite pleasure was the mounting longing for them rather than the gratification of that longing. "One has an overwhelming desire to eat what is cute," writes Sianai, and therefore cuteness is ideal for mass commodification because of its consumability. Cute objects are feminine, defenseless, and diminutive things, provoking our maternal desires to hold and nuzzle them, as I had with my mouthless Sanrio erasers, but they can also unlock our sadistic desires to master and violate them, which is why I probably held off using my stationery in order to ward off my darker instincts. Eventually, I gave in. I clicked the tip of my mechanical pencil, which snipped out a nib of lead. Because I had no interest in writing when I was young, I drew. I drew girls that looked nothing like me. I was at first a poor draftsman, outlining the U for the face and filling in eyes that were lopsided dewdrops and roofing the face with hair curls as coarse as bed springs. But over the years, my technique became refined and I could decently draw the anime girls I adored. I took pleasure in drawing the eyes because I, like everyone else, fetishized anime eyes, those bewitching orbs engorged with irises of snow-flecked sapphire and thatched over with the inkiest lashes. How huge and innocent those anime eyes, how meager my own slits. But the nose eluded me. I could not get that snub peck of a nose right, no matter how much I practiced drawing it. I had the misfortune of inheriting my father's pronounced nose that in profile looked like a 6. When I complained about it, my mother protested. It was a royal nose, but the kids in church called out the truth in their basic English. Why do you have a big nose? Big nose. I drew peck after peck on sheets of paper, wasting reams so I could pin down that perfect nose. Once I dreamed of anime girls soaring up and down on pogo sticks, their pigtails a nimbus of curls, their tartan skirts a swirl, their enormous eyes cracked with light. I looked up in time to see a girl arc up in the air and then rocket straight down for me to pogo my nose down to a button. Okay, so I thought I will end there. I guess we'll just start conversation, right? Okay, let me just get my notes here. I've known Meghan for a while, and I can't even count how many years, but I do recall, I knew her back in 2012 when she started getting these symptoms, and I feel like I was there, present during that journey of when she was going to doctor after doctor, trying to find a diagnosis for her illness, and then afterwards, I felt like I was sort of intimately present during the whole writing process of it. And, before Meghan wrote Invisible Kingdom, she wrote a book of poems called Sun and Days. And I remember those days. I don't even remember when it was. I think it was like 2014, 2015. We would get together every month or so, or 2 months or 3 months, and exchange drafts, exchange pages. And as I was saying before, my drafts were just embarrassingly rough. Before she turned in pages of Invisible Kingdom, she showed me these marvelous poems. And so I thought I would begin by asking the first question, which is that, I just wanted to bring it back to Sun and Days, actually, because I felt like that was when you kind of also started writing about Lyme and, kind of losing your identity, trying to find this diagnosis. And then after that, you wrote Invisible Kingdom. And and this also sort of echoes previous collections and books where you wrote a book of poems on grief, and then it turned into, and then you wrote a nonfiction book about grief, Your Mourning of Your Mother. And I was wondering if you could talk about that process. Why is it important to write about your lived experience as poetry before it comes nonfiction? Is it something that's planned? Is it something that's intuitive? What is the relationship between the two?
Yeah, that's such an amazing place to start, Kathy. Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone for being here, and to you. And your drafts were not wildly rough. We can talk about that later. Yeah, I have this compulsive need, I think, to explore the subjects that have gripped me and are haunting me, and to explore them in different forms, to discover what's revealed to me, I think, by those forms. I actually started the long goodbye before, well, no, I started writing poems after my mother died. And I remember quite vividly having this experience where I was trying to write about her death, and she died pretty young. She was 55. And I had this image that I would get to the end of the line break, and it was like there was an abyss there. And the openness of a poem, the multiplicity, the many possibilities, the potential rawness of it was just so completely overwhelming to me as an artist, right? I wasn't really able in those first months after we had lost her to form something out of my grief. And I started writing the long goodbye. And the reason I did was that I had this feeling that the sentence was kind of like a guy rope. When you're hiking on a mountain and there's a cliff on one side, and there are those ropes and little things to help you along your narrow path. And that was what the sentence became for me. And one sentence led to the next and led to the next and led to the next. And in the morning, I could wake up and there were sentences and I could start where I had left off, right? As you know, one of the really challenging things of being a poet is that you're so frequently confronting the blank page.
Mhm.
And we have to start again. So I think there was this very primal, intuitive response in the grief. I've realized about myself too that I think a challenge for all of us who are writers in the age of late capitalism is that our writing, our creativity, our play has become our work, right? We talk a lot about work. We talk in writing programs about like you have to be at your desk every day, you have to do this. That model really doesn't and didn't work for me, partly because I do live with chronic illness and not every day is a day where I can work. But also because I find that I kind of get tight, like my writing gets kind of tight and constrained if I don't bring that play into it. And so Sun and Days really emerged because I had gotten this amazing fellowship to be at Harvard and work on the Invisible Kingdom. And that was what I was there to do. And I did it. And then there was just this impish urge in me to just cheat on my book with something else, like go rediscover my like creative self that no one could see and make it secret, right? And make it fun and make it pleasurable. And so those poems really poured out of me when I was there, supposedly researching, which I did do. But it was like there were just these days where I sort of had to cheat on the book. In retrospect, too, I think that what happened was I had done about 4 months of super intensive reading, history of science, immunology textbooks, everything I could get my hands on, other memoirs, 19th century memoirs of people who were sick, the history of hysteria and how, the concept, why it arose as a diagnosis. I just done all this reading. And I think probably it needed to percolate so that I could shape it. And that was probably happening too, that intuitively I knew I needed to actually just take a little break and let that material sift so that I could start to shape it. Because I think a problem for the nonfiction writer who does a lot of research is the question of curation, right? And how do we bring in and how do we leave out? Yeah. But what about you? I mean, we talked about this when you shifted to Minor Feelings. What led you to the shift to, sorry, it's the end of the semester and there's a party happening near my house. But what led you to turn to nonfiction, Cathy?
I mean, it was actually somewhat similar to your experience where, like what you were saying, when you get to the end of the line, it's like looking over the cliffside. And, there's something that I found daunting about reaching the end of the line. But after I finished Engine Empire, I wanted to, I'm that kind of masochistic writer where I like to, after I'm done with a book or a project, I like to tackle a subject or a form that I was previously afraid to tackle, that I was uncomfortable about, or that I avoided I avoided. And I realized that after Engine Empire that I've never written from personal life. And so I thought I would do that. And I also wanted, by doing that, I also wanted to kind of directly, I've always written about race and migration and colonialism and so forth, but I also wanted to kind of tackle racial identity in a way that was much more direct, through the lens of autobiography. And I found that, to my surprise, that I couldn't do that through poetry. And I do think that, like, Lynn Hedginian, I'm totally butchering her quote. She said something about how poetry is the language of artifice, whereas prose is the language of sincerity. And of course, everyone has a different relationship to each genre, but I think that suited my, that kind of also paralleled my relationship, because I sort of saw the poem as a song, a platform, like, an elevated platform in which you threw your voice. And it didn't seem real or authentic. It didn't have also the kind of capaciousness. I wanted to kind of explore a range of tones that I needed to write autobiographically. So eventually I landed on essays. I mean, I was, I dabbled in journalism when I was in my 20s. I've also written criticism and reviews and so forth, but it was really, Minor Feelings was my first real foray into nonfiction. And I totally agree with you. Like, it's like, it's interesting what you were saying also about Sun and Days, and like, and how you were cheating when you were working on your nonfiction book, and you're working on the slide, because I'm trying to do that now. And I often find that when I'm working on prose and poetry, the prose tends to cannibalize the poetry. And it's like, because it's like, in certain ways, I find poetry to be really liberating, because it's like, I have more of a sense of play, and I don't think, and it's like, it's more attuned to discovery, where I'm not really sure what my subject is. I have to kind of write into my subject and so forth. But then the prose gobbles it up. I'm trying to really kind of keep it as separate as possible. But I was also curious about what you were saying about research, because this is also on my mind as well. And Invisible Kingdom was incorporated a daunting amount of research, a daunting amount of research, scientific, historical research that you got firsthand, and also through like pouring through books and so forth. And I was just wondering, like, how you were saying you needed it to like percolate and so forth. I was wondering like how that process of researching and writing works, because I also often find that when I'm researching, I also have to kind of let it metabolize in my body before I can write it in my voice. Can you talk about that experience of curation, and how you were able to get all of that data into a book, into what was a seamless narrative that seemed entirely in your voice, Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. But yeah, this is one of the great challenges for any nonfiction writer, because we're always dealing with information, even when we're writing memoir.
Mhm.
In this case, the challenge, it was really hard, right? I mean, that was part of what made the book take 10 years, was just, doing the reading, but then really working with all the notes. So I think a lot of this comes down to very granular, kind of almost quite nerdy things about how do you record what you've read and keep track of it, and how do you it's almost like an act of translation, right? You're taking that information, but you have to translate it into a text in which you're bringing that in, in a way that it's truthful, right? In a way that seems to lend itself to understanding, but is curated so that the reader is hand is being held and they're being taken through a kind of context that you're establishing, and hopefully allowing them to shadow your own experience of accumulating knowledge, right? So for me, that process really starts with like a lot of note taking, very obsessive note taking. I have a lot of note cards. I read books, that I reread them and copy everything I think I'm going to use into a master document. And then I highlight what I think I'm really going to use. And then I go back to that over and over. And I kind of slowly synthesize and figure out which of those quotes are really going to make their way into the book. And it's a laborious and painstaking process in which I often think, why am I doing this? I'm spending hours copying, literally typing out, whole swaths of books that I know I'm never going to use all of that material. But I think the reason I'm doing it is that it's almost like that process of copying teaches me what my own concerns are and what the data points are that I really, and sort of argumentative beats and context that I really want that reader to have. So there's this kind of metabolizing just through this physical process of translating the knowledge from one person's book slowly into my notes and then into my own text. But it was compounded and hard in this case because one of my major symptoms was, and still is, brain fog, where it's hard to remember exactly. I used to have a great memory and now it's just hard for me to remember, did I read that in this book or that book? So I had to be really careful about note taking. This is maybe a more granular answer than you wanted, but the bigger picture answer, I think, is that when you're dealing with information, you don't want to let it overwhelm the narrative, overwhelm this propulsion, right? So one of the craft things that I was working with really closely writing the book was, how do I get the reader to want to assimilate this information? How do I kind of seduce them? How do I make this pleasurable, right? Even though there's a lot of science, there's some information about T cells and B cells and this kind of cytokine and, macrophages. And how do I make that exciting and accessible? And I think the answer is by really combining it and making sure that you're finding the right place for it. And so that you're creating a kind of narrative suspense with the memoir, with the personal writing. What I read for you all tonight was actually more the abstract part. I realized I should have read a part that has a little more of the memoir writing, but the book toggles between this memoiristic mode and this research mode. And I'll just say quickly that I totally connect to what you say about directness in prose, and the Hudginian quote is great, right? That there's a sort of directness or sincerity in prose, and that poetry can be quite liberating. And I think a part of the process of writing this book, strangely, was writing Sun and Days. As we're talking, I'm remembering that a reason I stopped writing The Invisible Kingdom was that there was a moment where I grew frustrated with the transparency of prose, because one of the problems of writing illness, and especially poorly understood illness, is that there are aspects of it that absolutely live outside language, right? That we don't have language for, we don't have concepts for, we don't know how to narrativize or explain. We don't really have a word for brain fog that explains what it is. And I think at that stage in the writing, I really wanted to honor those silences and the frustrations and the impossibilities and the sort of epistemological stutters of, trying to say something that couldn't be said. And I really needed to do that in those lyric essays and Sun and Days before I could go back to The Invisible Kingdom and really relish what I was able to do there, which was to kind of assemble information and put it together in a slightly more logical, I don't know, it's like the book itself is smoother than the experience, right? If you know what I mean. I try to bring that awareness into the book.
Yeah, going off of that, I was thinking, this actually sort of was my kind of next question, which is about what you're talking about, a more ineffable language that describes the experience of, the physiological experience of illness. It reminds me of that Elaine Scarry book, The Body in Pain, and how she talks about the difficulty of actually articulating or expressing pain and the political and perceptual complications that arise from that difficulty. She also talks about how pain even shatters or destroys language. And you talk about that in your book, and how this sort of chronic illness and brain fog and fatigue and not being diagnosed early on just kind of also unraveled your identity as well. You kind of answer this, but I was thinking if you could talk a little bit more about it. What is it about the poetic language that helped you articulate that pain? And can you also talk about the difficulties in describing it as well? And maybe in particular, the pain that accompanies chronic illness, then rather than say, I don't know, getting into a car accident or cancer and so forth. There are also other writers who completely disagree with Elaine Scarry and everything. Actually, there's a million ways for the body to articulate the pain. But anyway, yeah.
It's such a great question, Cathy, and it makes me think of the connections between our books that you so beautifully laid out at the beginning, which is that I do think, as different as our books are, and we're writing about different worlds, you're writing about experience of being Asian American and race in America, and I'm writing about illness. They both really are trying to talk about the condition of feeling unseen and unable to communicate, unable to make yourself heard, right? And also about the incredible array of subtle, complex, and sometimes quite disfiguring knock-on effects of that, right? That are, we just lack conceptual frameworks for, so we therefore lack narratives for. So one of the things I try to say to people about my experience of chronic illness, which is this particular experience of living with conditions that my doctors could not identify for years, was that there was the actual pain and suffering of the symptoms, which was significant, right? Brain fog, strange neurological problems, shocks all over my body, fatigue, and then actual physical pain that roamed around. But there was the secondary pain, which was really the primary pain in a way, of being invisible and of having that experience rendered meaningless by virtue of my inability to explain it to another person and their inability to receive and witness it. And I think that the reason I wrote the book was to create some of these conceptual frameworks and to therefore try to help in some way people feel heard and seen, but also to just start carving out that language where, so much of what we talk about in life is because we have a pre-existing conceptual framework for it, right? A big recent one, obviously, being Me Too, is like a huge conceptual framework that we didn't quite have, right, previously. So I think that one of the reasons writing the poems was important was just that I really had to find a way as a writer to make room for some formally, I don't know, inventive, but just, I really had to put the pressure on myself of discovering some language for what could be said and where I felt I was coming up against the limits of what could be said, and then how to try to narrativize all that my book was not going to be able to say, right? All of the ways in which it's resisting certain kinds of both my books, The Invisible Kingdom too, are both resisting certain kinds of illness narratives that trend toward recovery or remediation or, this was all worth it. Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And there are narrative elements of that, but there also had to be a kind of linguistic experience of that. And I think I just felt like I had to experience that as an artist, as a writer, before I wrote a book that tried to smooth some of that over because it wouldn't be authentic, right? It seems weird as I'm saying it, but and then I think it really helped me write The Invisible Kingdom. And a lot of The Invisible Kingdom, there are moments where I stop and say, I really can't explain this to you, or I wish I didn't have to explain this to you, or I have no words for this. This is where silence creeps in. And I think I had to find ways to make silence and resistance legible, right? And that was the work of this particular book. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you totally did.
You must feel this too. And I wonder if part of why you wrote essays too, Cathy, I don't know, I've never really asked you this question, is why essays rather than a book length piece. But I wonder if part of it is that essays foreground incompletion, not incompletion, but that there are many, that they're polyvocal. The book becomes polyvocal. The book becomes multiple, right? It has multiple advantages. Was that part of your thinking, or can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I said this before, when you think about the etymology of essay, it's attempts, right? And so it's like I was seeing, and I find essays, individual, I mean, they're interlinked, but first of all, I have to say, since I was kind of diving into prose for the first time, a book length prose, it seemed less daunting to, to kind of tackle a collection of essays where I started with one and then I started with another and then I wrote another, rather than deciding that I was going to write like a book of a memoir or a book of cultural criticism. But you're totally right. It's that kind of like vocality that really attracted me to the essay. And people, the essay takes on so many different forms, right? I mean, like now, of course, the lyric essay is really quite popular among people, but I think that was also what attracted me to the essay, was that it was, that there was something kind of structuralist about it. At the same time, it was easier for me to make a kind of argument, which isn't, and that was why I pursued the essay rather than poetry, was because I wanted to make a kind of argument, but it was also a kind of open form so that I could incorporate multiple frameworks of thinking. So, whether it's history or, literary criticism, memoir, manifesto, and so forth. I didn't think like if I were to write a memoir, it would have been able to kind of hold those different modes of thinking in the same way,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's right. It gets harder because you have to create the shifts. You have to create a voice that would encompass all of it, right? Which is a hard voice to create. And I also think in your case with the essays, you needed these really different advantages.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about like in Minor Feelings, like I chose the essay or I chose the episodic form because I needed exit routes. I needed kind of these points where I could come back and not attack, but approach my subject matter from a different angle. And it was the only way I could do it, because I'm not saying Asian American identity is like chronic illness, although sometimes it can feel that way. But it's there's something very kind of, or any racial identity really, is that it's such an open-ended, ambiguous question that there's like I needed those moments where I could kind of leave and then come back and use and write about the subject matter from a different triggering subject, to use like a poetic term, so yeah. What by the way, should we go to Q&A, or how are we doing, by the way? I know it's 8, so I just wanted to check.
Yeah, should we take some questions, or do you want to do one more question and we'll take over here?
Well, I could ask one more question.
I encourage everyone to put questions in the chat while Cathy is asking one more question, and then we'll turn to your questions. Yeah.
Okay, so I focused my questions mostly on the craft of writing, because I know there are a lot of writers in the talk, but I feel like I have to ask one very general, broad question about illness itself. And my apologies for this being such a broad question, but I thought you could say as much or as little as you need for this broad question. But in your intro, you talk about how there are 24 million people with autoimmune disease. Can you tell everyone who haven't yet read the book and who haven't had experience with autoimmune disease, or known anyone with autoimmune disease, why it's on the rise and why it's crucial to care about the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a big part of the book is sort of making the case about, just as you said, why this touches all of us, right? And I think now more than ever that's become clear with the pandemic and long COVID. But what really astonished me, I mean, I had just a very naive understanding of my own body and of illness, right? I had absorbed this very mechanistic idea of my body as a series of parts. Even though I was a poet, and of course I have these other thoughts and feelings about my body too, as a whole and as a system that was sensitive to the world around it. My experience of medicine had always been of this kind of mechanistic, you've broken your wrist, you've done this, right? So when I got sick, part of the reason it took me a long time to realize I was sick was that I had these amorphous symptoms that roamed my body. And I had to do quite a lot of learning and educating of myself to understand why that wasn't either a coincidence or terrible luck or a sign that I was inventing it, right? That actually was part of the logic of illness itself. And in the course of doing that research, I came to see that my understandings of disease were really limited, and that an emerging paradigm of medicine is looking at all of the ways that there are these pathways to multi-systemic, complicated, and very poorly understood conditions that roam the body and are often triggered by things like infection, possibly chemicals in the environment, changes to our microbiome, that colony of bacteria that lives, in our gut and helps us digest food and process serotonin, and also on our skin and every part of our body. And as I was learning about this, I realized that although I had felt incredibly lonely, the irony was that I was actually one of millions and one of this growing category of sick people. And it really came to be very evident to me as a cultural critic, right? As someone who had spent a decade writing about culture for different magazines, or more than a decade, sad to say, that something was going on here that we weren't quite paying attention to. And it's funny, I started the book a long time ago, in 2012. And at that point, not many people were talking about autoimmune diseases. I actually wrote a piece for the New Yorker about my experience of autoimmune disease in 2013. And it was one of very few pieces in a kind of mainstream magazine about autoimmune disease. I do feel that had changed a lot by the time I finished the book. And so part of the work of the book is showing like this category of illness is growing at extraordinary rates because of changes in our environment. Right. That's the long, I got to that answer in the long way. But, basically what's happening is we're changing our environment, and our bodies and our health are changing. And so this concerns all of us, because no one of us can protect our health or get better without thinking about each of us as part of an interconnected ecosystem. And I'll just say quickly that I think the experience of getting sick in this way was in some ways sort of radicalizing, because it really shifted me out of this sort of model, the ethos of individualism, which I think I was really raised with, right? To try to excel in your own life, and really pushed me in ways that my mother's death had too. And The Long Goodbye is also about this. It pushed me toward really looking at the ways in which the absence of a model of care and ethic of interconnectedness is harming all of us and hurting all of us. Yeah, and I think we see that in the pandemic. Yeah. Someone made a very good point. People were writing about, yes, absolutely. That's why I made the point that it was not appearing in mainstream magazines. Exactly. And it does feel like we're making some shift where there's at least a little bit more urgency to write about. Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience? Do people want to, can we see the Q&A, or people want to put questions in the chat?
Yeah, one question that we have while you're looking for some other questions. You're both poets as well as nonfiction writers. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the revision process for both genres and how it's similar and different for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what Cathy was getting at earlier, but my experience writing poems is that I don't know, I'm often thinking about what the poem needs and the exploration or the search for meaning to be revealed to me. You were talking about this, Cathy, that you write toward your subject. You don't know what the subject is. There's a way in which making a poem is a quite exploratory process. And so I think for me, the revision process is being very attuned to what accidents of meaning have happened on the page that teach me something about my own habits of thought or my own interests or about language itself and show me the way forward, right? So I'm revising in a really intuitive way, if that makes sense. Looking for sort of the heat of the language. Whereas with the nonfiction book, I was really revising it with imagined readers in mind, and sometimes quite specific readers in my head. And really asking myself questions like, okay, I've just written 20 pages about the immune system. Is the reader going to be able to make their way through those 20 pages? I probably need to condense them. A lot of the work was revising to keep some of the depth of the book, but make it a little bit less of a thicket of information in places, and trying to find suspense, questions of propulsion. How am I going to keep the reader going forward? That's a lot of my revision process, is how do I make this chapter set the reader up with a question that she needs to answer in the next chapter. Yeah.
I would say that there's some similarities in the revision process for both poetry and prose, where for me, the form comes later. Like a lot of it in the beginning is kind of this narrative dump or information dump or stream of conscious dump, and then as I'm revising, eventually, both in poetry and prose, it gets chiseled into some kind of form or later. Unfortunately, I wish, I think I would be a much more efficient writer, but I wish that I could also be less intuitive in nonfiction or prose. I wish I had an outline and like sort of a point that I wanted to make before I began writing, before I launch into the prose piece. But unfortunately, I also approach it as a poet, where I have to kind of, writing is a way for me to find clarity in what in my life. It's like, or writing is also an aid to memory. Writing is also, by writing more, it also unlocks further, it unlocks my memories in a way that I wouldn't if I were to just like think about it. And writing is also a way for me to, and also like the revision process, this is a way for me to kind of dig deeper into the truth. And I think that's also part of it. I think when I'm first drafting, especially when it's sort of memoiristic, like when I'm first drafting, there's a guardedness to it. There's less, I may tend to be, as it was with Minor Feelings, it was much more critical, it was much more theoretical, it was much more of a polemic and so forth. And I found that in the revision process, I had to kind of like, revising helped me to kind of dig deeper into these uncomfortable truths that I'm not able to do in the first or second draft even.
That's such a good point, and I totally agree that a lot of the revision for me in nonfiction was asking myself the question, what haven't I said because I'm too scared of saying it or too uncomfortable to say it? And what would happen if I did say it, and what would be elucidated and clarified? What might come if I said that thing quite directly?
Yeah.
So there's another question from Jennifer, and her question is, she mentions that she recently read Meghan's book, and she refers to Emmanuel Levinas' idea of the face, that it kept ringing in her head, especially when Meghan, when you quote the moral philosopher explaining, quote, "Your suffering is burdensome to me." Could you both, or either of you, talk more about the ethical and the moral aspect of that lack of recognition?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought up Levinas. I think that's right, that this idea that we owe something, we owe recognition to the face of the other, um, is so important. And absolutely, I think my entire book is about this question of, I don't know, inviting the reader, and in particular, inviting people who maybe aren't living with chronic illness into a space where we can consider together what it means to have an ethical obligation to one another. And I think, although the book is very critical of the healthcare system, a big aspect of the book for me is wanting to have a conversation that gets us to a healthcare system that restores to doctors the dignity of the ethical work they do, which I fear that the bureaucracy of our system strips away that work, right? That it makes it really hard for them to be the ethical practitioners that at least some of them want to be, right? Not all of them. So yeah, I don't have a good answer to you except to say that this seems to be the question, right? Lack of recognition, I think, is a moral failure. It's an ethical failure. I think it's a societal failure. How we live, how we live in a place where there, in a world, in a place, in a time when there's so much suffering and it's so hard to witness is another question, right? Which is, it is hard to think about and recognize the suffering of others, but the transformative, the truly transformative, this sounds hokey, but experience of being sick, I think, was to kind of radicalize my understanding of what I didn't know, right? And how much about other people's experiences I just could not know, and therefore just had to listen to and witness. Yeah, Cathy, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about this more in terms of your book. It reminds me of also, I mean, adjacent to this, like, just got I'm bad with title, Judith Butler's book. Her book is called Forces of Nonviolence, and she talks about lives that are considered grievable and non-grievable, and the kind of inequities of that. And this also relates to the lack of recognition of suffering. And also why, so, and you could apply that to, right, Black Lives Matter, to just, and everything that's happening in this country, right? Why certain lives are grievable and why others are not considered grievable. And I was thinking also about this lack of recognition of suffering and how that ripples across the medical profession, and how you are experiencing that as a woman, especially, and I think we didn't touch upon that, but also how gender affects recognition of suffering. And also, I'm sure you mentioned this as well, with autoimmune diseases and long COVID, where there was also a lack of recognition for low income. Yes. And low income and Black and brown patients as well. So we're talking about invisibility. There are also gradations, quite a radical gradations of invisibility too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's where this becomes really a pressing ethical question too, right? Is that you see, I guess part of what I was trying to get at too is that when I say these diseases are this sort of signature diseases of our time, part of what I mean is that when we hold them up and look at these questions, who is grievable, who's treatable, whose illnesses do we listen to and take seriously, whose do we ignore, we see a lens of our own ethical commitments or lack of commitments. And I talk a lot about gender and the fact that many of these illnesses are experienced overwhelmingly by women. And then exactly what you're talking about, which is the question of rural communities and their access, Black and brown people, and the ideas of this Arlene Geronimus's idea of weathering, which is that, racism itself can act on the body like an infection or a chronic illness. It kind of weathers the body and creates all this stress on the body that literally changes the biology of it. And so when we look at these kinds of conditions, we see a kind of palimpsest of our ethical commitments or lack of them, our violences toward one another. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see we have a few more questions.
We had a question from Cindy Beerfilly about if the two of you have ever considered working on a hybrid book together, since to exchange work and edit each other's work.
Or if we've either, I think, a hybrid book of our own. Yeah. Sun and Days kind of is. It has like two lyric essays, but I guess it really is a book of poetry. I love that idea. Yes, now I am considering it. Thank you, Cindy.
A hybrid book of your own that incorporates poetry and essay. Is that what you're saying, or like a hybrid collaborative?
I think she means how do each of us has either of us thought about?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm kind of working on one right now, so we'll see how that goes. I have to say that now that I've experienced working on a prose book, there's a part of me that wants to like iron out the line breaks and turn it into sentences, and I'm like, but of course, a poem, what is a poem, right? There's so much, it's becoming more and more elastic as poetry, as all of us are getting older, so yeah. But I have actually in the past, I would say that most of my books of poems have been hybrid in one sense or another.
Yeah. I do. I mean, I think for me, one reason I write in different forms and genres is that it always seems to me, since I know we have a lot of writers here, that different forms help solve different problems and help create different opportunities and different discoveries. And I think that's why I can't settle down to one kind of form or genre, and why, like Cathy said, each time I write a book, I want it to feel I want it to present a formal problem that I haven't solved before, which while I'm writing it, I'm like, why did I do this to myself? But there's that kind of pleasure in discovery, pleasure and pain.
Mm-hmm.
What is a poem? What is a memoir? What is any of this, right? I think that's the question you ask yourself as you're starting. What is this?
Yeah, I mean, also for me, and I'm sure as it is for you, Megan, a little bit, but there isn't a genre that I met that I haven't wanted to trespass. It's just an compulsion in me, because I think it depends how you define genre, right? Whether it's like, if you're talking about it from a marketing perspective, or you're talking about it as a formal constraint, but we are dealing with constraints of some sort, right? Like either it's a formal constraint or there's like an audience, right? It's like it's demarcating an audience for that form. And I'm always, I tackle that genre in order to question the audience that it's targeting, and also the constraints that, sort of the receive, why these formal constraints are there in the first place, so.
Well, and also because, I mean, I guess it can sound abstract to non-writers if we're talking about form, right? I always think, right, why do we talk so much about form? Why does form matter? And part of it is that I think in both our cases too, we're trying to make visible ways that the culture has created a form that feels to us unsatisfying. It feels reductive. It's silencing and marginalizing, right? Quite literally, in ways that are harmful. And part of why I make writing around my illness is that I know I can turn the experience into a shape that I hope will speak to a lot of people and help give it form and help complicate this really reductive way we have of, many reductive ways we have of silencing and marginalizing and making invisible experiences that we're uncomfortable with, right? Which is what it often comes down to, and goes back to that ethical question, which is hard to look at what discomfits us.
And you have to kind of reformulate whatever form you're working in. And in fact, you talk about that in the book as well, not necessarily the form of whether it's memoir or not, but you also talk about narrative, right? And like how, what was the term that you used? Restitutive?
That's this wonderful sociologist, Arthur Frank, who writes about the fact that many of the kinds of illness stories we tell as a culture are what he calls restitution narratives, where the illness brings something good with it, right? That's the kind of story we want to tell about illness, because it kind of lets us off the hook as witnesses or readers of it. And, I was really trying not to write a restitution narrative, because part of the advocacy I'm doing is to say, we don't have restitution. We have to look at this. We have to bring that research and that attention and care to this problem that is very much unsolved, and now even worse because of long COVID. Yeah.
Are there more questions that in the chat box, or?
We did have a question from Marion Brown. Let me just, and I guess that's probably going to be our last question of the night. Marion asks, in putting together the pieces, in the case of the essay collection, Cathy, can you talk about deciding how much to put in and what to restrain?
How much to put in?
How much to present to the reader and how much to leave out?
That's a really, that's a good question. I mean, I think like, in drafting the essays, like I didn't, I think it depends on the kind of collection that you're writing. There are people who write collections of essays where the essays have been previously published. In my case, so it's more of like an anthology, I guess, of published essays, whereas for me it was, or I guess the collection, but for me at least, these were all unpublished essays, and I was sort of writing them as such. And what I often found happening was that I would be done with one essay, but then there was this whole other kind of argument or subject that I wanted to pursue that I wasn't able to fit into that essay. So like say white innocence, like I was working on an essay on Richard Pryor and race and stand up, and I wanted to say something about white innocence, and I was like, that's not going to fit into this essay, so I'm going to make a whole new essay about that in the next essay, or and so forth. And so that way, like I wanted, and because of that, I wanted to have a sense of kind of a fluid sense of, not fluid, but a sense of journey throughout from the one essay to the next, where it wasn't necessarily based on any kind of linear chronological argument, but it was more based on sort of patterns of thinking that would recur throughout. And in that way, it wasn't that different from like collection of essays where I would pick up in the first essay, I would pose a question and then not answer it until the third or fourth essay, so that it had more of a book length feel rather than like discrete essays. So that was like how it developed. In terms of restraint, I think, in terms of restraint, when I'm thinking about like a collection of, as a collection, I think it was really, the only way I can answer it is like endings, where I really thought a lot about endings for essays. And it was really important for me to not try to have like this orchestral climactic ending for each essay, that all of each essay, because it was, all of them were just sort of posing questions and answering those questions with more questions. And it was like, for me, it had to kind of restrain myself from giving some kind of resolution to each kind of essay, so that the different pieces were able to kind of click together in such a way, if that makes any sense. And there was also, when you put in a collection together, of course, there's also, you see all the repetitions, you see like you yourself repeating yourself constantly, whether it's like, words, phrases, narratives, and so forth, ideas, so that, there was a lot of pruning in that respect as well. Yeah. Megan, do you want to answer that question?
I haven't written an essay collection.
I know, I mean, and
I'm thinking, I think that's really a good question for you. I'm thinking about writing an essay collection right now, or I'm working on something that feels like it might be an essay from which other essays come, or maybe it's a book, I don't know. So I don't know. I loved hearing you. Thank you so much, Cathy, for being in conversation with me. And I know Lynn will probably say goodbye, but I just want to thank everyone for being here and for the really incredible questions and conversation we've been able to hear. It feels like the me who was really sick 10 years ago would not have imagined I would be able to do this and be here. So every moment is just a shining joy for me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate you doing this, Meghan, even though you're feeling sick tonight. So that was very generous of you. Thank you both for being here, for explaining your process, and for reading from these wonderful collections. And please, all of you, if you don't yet have their books, please get them from your local bookstores. And we will see you hopefully for our last reading when Claudia Rankin and Emily Skillings read. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Treasure and pleasure.
Bye. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you, Lynn McGee, for co-hosting this
Thank you,
event.
Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer and Lynn.